Hello and welcome to a reading by Mario Velez of Frank Herbert's classic, Dune. Book 1, page 171 of this edition, chapter 15. My father, the Padisha Emporer, took me by the hand one day, and I sensed in the ways my mother had taught me that he was disturbed. He led me down the hall of portraits to the ego-likeness of the Duke Leto Atreides. I marked the strong resemblance between them, my father and this man in the portrait, both with thin, elegant faces and sharp features dominated by cold eyes. "Princess daughter," my father said, "I would that you'd been older when it came time for this man to choose a woman." My father was 71 at the time, and looking no older than the man in the portrait, and I was but 14, yet I remember deducing in that instant that my father secretly wished the Duke had been his son, and disliked the political necessities that made them enemies. From In My Father's House, by the Princess Irulan. His first encounter with the people he had been ordered to betray left Dr. Kynes shaken. He prided himself on being a scientist to whom legends were merely interesting clues, pointing toward cultural roots. Yet the boy fitted the ancient prophecy so precisely. He had the questing eyes and the air of reserved candor. Of course, the prophecy left certain latitude as to whether the Mother Goddess would bring the Messiah with her or produce him on the scene. Still, there was this odd correspondence between prediction and persons. They met in the mid-morning outside the Arrakeen landing field's administration building. An unmarked ornithopter squatted nearby, humming softly on standby, like a somnolent insect. An Atreides guard stood beside it, with bared sword and the faint air distortion of a shield around him. Kynes sneered at the shield pattern, thinking, Arrakis has a surprise for them here. The planetologist raised a hand, signaled for his Fremen guard to fall back. He strode on ahead toward the building's entrance, the dark hole in plastic-coated rock. So exposed, that monolithic building, he thought. So much less suitable than a cave. Movement within the entrance caught his attention. He stopped, taking the moment to adjust his robe and the set of his Stillsuit at the left shoulder. The entrance door swung wide. Atreides guards emerged swiftly, and all of them heavily armed. Slow pellet stunners, swords, and shields. Behind them came a tall man, hawk-faced, dark of skin and hair. He wore a juba cloak with Atreides crest at the breast, and wore it in a way that betrayed his unfamiliarity with the garment. It clung to the legs of his Stillsuit on one side. It lacked a free-swinging, striding rhythm. Beside the man walked a youth with the same dark hair but rounder in face. The youth seemed small for the 15 years Kynes knew him to have, but the young body carried a sense of command, a poised assurance, as though he saw and knew things all around him that were not visible to others. And he wore the same style cloak as his father, yet with casual ease that made one think the boy had always worn such clothing. The Mahdi will be aware of things others cannot see, went the prophecy. Kynes shook his head, telling himself, they're just people. With the two garbed like them for the desert came a man Kynes recognized, Gurney Halleck. Kynes took a deep breath to still his resentment against Halleck, who had briefed him on how to behave with the Duke and Duke Lair. You may call them Duke, my lord, or sire. Nobleborn is also correct, but usually reserved for more formal occasions. The son may be addressed as young master or my lord. The Duke is a man of much leniency, but brooks little familiarity. And Kynes thought as he watched the group approach, they'll learn soon enough who's master on Arrakis. Order me questioned half the night by the mentat, will they? Expect me to guide them on an inspection of spice mining, do they? The import of Hawat's questions had not escaped Kynes. They wanted the Imperial bases, and it was obvious they'd learned of the bases from Idaho. I will have Stillgars send Idaho's head to this Duke, Kynes told himself. The ducal party was only a few paces away now, their feet in the desert boots crunching the sand. Kynes bowed. My Lord Duke. As he had approached the solitary figure standing near the ornithopter, Leto had studied him. Tall, thin, dressed for the desert in loose robe, stillsuit, and low boots. The man's hood was thrown back, its veil hanging to one side, revealing long sandy hair and sparse beard. The eyes were that fathomless blue within blue under thick brows. Remains of dark stains smudged his eye sockets. "You're the ecologist," the Duke said. "We prefer the old title here, my lord," Kynes said. "Planetologist." "As you wish," the Duke said. He glanced down at Paul. "Son, this is the judge of the change, the arbiter of dispute. The man set here to see that the forms are obeyed in our assumption of power over this fief." He glanced at Kynes. "And this is my son." "My lord," Kynes said. "Are you Fremen?" Paul asked. Kynes smiled. "I am accepted in both sietch and village, young master. But I am in His Majesty's service, the Imperial Planetologist." Paul nodded, impressed by the man's air of strength. Halleck had pointed Kynes out to Paul from an upper window of the administration building. The man standing there with the Fremen escort, the one moving now toward the ornithopter. Paul had inspected Kynes briefly with binoculars. Noting the prim, straight mouth, the high forehead, Halleck had spoken in Paul's ear. "Odd sort of fellow. Has a precise way of speaking. Clipped off, no fuzzy edges. Razor apt." And the Duke behind them had said, "Scientist type." Now only a few feet from the man, Paul sensed the power in Kynes, the impact of personality, as though he were blood royal, born to command. "I understand we have you to thank for our stillsuits and these cloaks," the Duke said. "I hope they will fit, my lord," Kynes said. "They're a Fremen make, and as near as possible the dimensions given me by your man, Halleck here." "I was concerned that you said you couldn't take us into the desert unless we wore these garments," the Duke said. "We can carry plenty of water. We don't intend to be out long, and we'll have air cover. The escort you see overhead right now. It isn't likely we'd be forced down." Kynes stared at him, seeing the water-fat flesh. He spoke coldly. "You never talk of likelihoods on Arrakis. You speak only of possibilities." Halleck stiffened. "The Duke is to be addressed as my lord or sire." Leto gave Halleck their private hand signal to desist, said, "Our ways are new here, Gurney. We must make allowances." "As you wish, sire." "We are indebted to you, Dr. Kynes," Leto said. "These suits and the consideration for our welfare will be remembered." On impulse, Paul called to mind a quotation from the OC Bible, said, "The gift is the blessing of the giver." The words rang out over loud in the still air. The Fremen escort Kynes had left in the shade of the administration building leaped up from their squatting repose, muttering in open agitation. One cried out, "Lisan al-Gaib!" Kynes whirled, gave a curt, chopping signal with a hand, waved the guard away. They fell back, grumbling amongst themselves, trailed away around the building. "Most interesting," Leto said. Kynes passed a hard glare over the Duke and Paul, said, "Most of the desert natives here are superstitious. Pay no attention to them. They mean no harm." But he thought of the words of the legend. "They will greet you with holy words, and your gifts will be a blessing." Ooh. Leto's assessment of Kynes, based partly on Hawat's brief verbal report, guarded and full of suspicions, suddenly crystallized. The man was Fremen. Kynes had come with a Fremen escort, which could mean simply that the Fremen were testing their new freedom to enter urban areas, but it had seemed an honor guard. And by his manner, Kynes was a proud man, accustomed to freedom, his tongue and his manner guarded only by his own suspicions. Paul's question had been direct and persistent. Kynes had gone native. "Shouldn't we be going, sire?" Halleck asked. The Duke nodded. I'll fly my own thopter. Kynes can sit up front with me to direct me. You and Paul take the rear seats. One moment, please, Kynes said. With your permission, sire, I must check the security of your suits. The Duke started to speak, but Kynes pressed on. I have concern for my own flesh as well as yours, my lord. I'm well aware of whose throat would be slit should harm befall you two while you're in my care. The Duke frowned, thinking, how delicate this moment. If I refuse, it may offend him. And this could be a man whose value to me is beyond measure. Yet, to let him inside my shield, touching my person, when I know so little about him. Thoughts flicked through his mind with decision hard on their heels. We're in your hands, the Duke said. He stepped forward, opening his robe, saw Halleck come up on the balls of his feet, poised and alert, but remaining where he was. And if you'd be so kind, the Duke said, I'd appreciate an explanation of the suit from one who lives so intimately with it. Certainly, Kynes said. He felt up under the robe for the shoulder seals, speaking as he examined the suit. It's basically a micro sandwich, a high-efficiency filter, and heat exchange system. He adjusted the shoulder seals. The skin contact layer's porous. Perspiration passes through it, having cooled the body. Near normal evaporation process, the next two layers, Kynes tightened the chest fit, include heat-exchanged filaments and salt precipitators. Salts reclaimed. The Duke lifted his arms at a gesture, said, Most interesting. Breathe deeply, Kynes said. The Duke obeyed. Kynes studied the underarm seals, adjusted one. Motions of the body, especially breathing, he said, and some osmotic action provide the pumping force. He loosened the chest fit slightly. Reclaimed water circulates to catch pockets, from which you draw it through this tube in the clip of your neck. The Duke twisted his chin in and down to look at the end of the tube. Efficient and convenient, he said. Good engineering. Kynes knelt, examined the leg seals. Urine and feces are processed in the thigh pads, he said, and stood up, felt the neck fitting, lifted a sectioned flap there. In the open desert, you wear this filter across your face. This tube in the nostrils with these plugs to ensure a tight fit. Breathe in through the mouth filter, out through the nose tube. With a Fremen suit in good working order, you won't lose more than a thimbleful of moisture a day, even if you're caught in the Great Erg. A thimbleful a day? The Duke said. Kynes pressed a finger against the suit's forehead pad, said, This may rub a little. If it irritates you, please tell me. I could slit patch it a bit tighter. My thanks, the Duke said. He moved his shoulders in the suit as Kynes stepped back, realizing that it did feel better now, tighter and less irritating. Kynes turned to Paul. Now let's have a look at you, lad. A good man, but he'll have to learn to address us properly, the Duke thought. Paul stood passively as Kynes inspected the suit. It had been an odd sensation putting on the crinkling, slick surface garment. In his foreconsciousness had been the absolute knowledge that he had never before worn a stillsuit. Yet each motion of adjusting the adhesion tabs under Gurney's inspection in expert guidance had seemed natural, instinctive. When he had tightened the chest to gain maximum pumping action for the motion of breathing, he had known what he did and why. When he had fitted the neck and forehead tabs tightly, he had known it was to prevent friction blisters. Kynes straightened, stepped back with a puzzled expression. You've worn a stillsuit before, he asked. This is the first time. Then someone adjusted it for you. No. Your desert boots are fitted slip fashion at the ankles. Who told you to do that? It seemed the right way. That it most certainly is. And Kynes rubbed his cheek, thinking of the legend. He shall know your ways, as though born to them. We waste time, the Duke said. He gestured to the waiting thopter, led the way, accepting the guard's salute with a nod. He climbed in, fastened his safety harness, checked controls and instruments. The craft creaked as the others clambered aboard. Kynes fastened his harness, focused on the padded comfort of the aircraft. Soft luxury of gray-green upholstery, gleaming instruments, the sensation of filtered and washed air in his lungs as doors slammed and vents fans whirred alive. So soft, he thought. All secure, sire, Halleck said. Leto fed power to the wings, felt them cup and dip once, twice. They were airborne in 10 meters, wings feathered tightly, and the afterjets thrusting them upward in a steep, hissing climb. Southeast over the shield wall, Kynes said. That's where I told your Sandmaster to concentrate his equipment. Right. The Duke banked into his air cover, the other craft taking up their guard positions as they headed southeast. The design and manufacture of these stillsuits bespeaks a high degree of sophistication, the Duke said. Someday I may show you a siege factory, Kynes said. I would find that interesting, the Duke said. I note that suits are manufactured also in some of the garrison cities. Inferior copies, Kynes said. Any DUNE man who values his skin wears a Fremen suit. And it'll hold your water lost to a thimbleful a day. Properly suited, your forehead capped tight, all seals in order. Your major water loss is through the palms of your hands, Kynes said. You can wear suit gloves if you're not using your hands for critical work, but most Fremen in the open desert rub their hands with juice from the leaves of the creosote bush. It inhibits perspiration. The Duke glanced down to the left at the broken landscape of the shield wall, chasms of tortured rock, patches of yellow-brown crossed by black lines of fault shattering. It was as though someone had dropped this ground from space and left it where it smashed. They crossed a shallow basin with the clear outline of gray sand spreading across it from a canyon opening to the south. The sand fingers ran out into the basin, a dry delta outlined against darker rock. Kynes sat back, thinking about the water-fat flesh he had felt beneath the stillsuits. They wore shield belts over their robes, slow pellet stunners at the waist, coin-sized emergency transmitter on cords around their necks. Both the Duke and his son carried knives in wrist sheaths, and the sheaths appeared well-worn. The people struck Kynes as a strange combination of softness and armed strength. There was a poise to them totally unlike the Harkonnens. When you report to the Emperor on the change of government here, will you say we observed the rules? Leto asked. He glanced at Kynes, back to their course. The Harkonnens left. You came, Kynes said. And is everything as it should be? Leto asked. Momentary tension showed the tightening of a muscle along Kynes' jaw. As a planetologist, a judge of the change, I am a direct subject of the Imperium, my lord. The Duke smiled grimly. But we both know the realities. I remind you that His Majesty supports my work. Indeed. And what is your work? In the brief silence, Paul thought, he's pushing this Kynes too hard. Paul glanced at Halleck, but the minstrel warrior was staring out at the barren landscape. Kynes spoke stiffly. You, of course, referred to my duties as planetologist. Of course. It is a mostly dry land biology and botany. Some geological work, core drilling and testing. You never really exhaust the possibilities of an entire planet. Do you always investigate spice? Kynes turned, and Paul noted the hard line on the man's cheek. A curious question, my lord. Bear in mind, Kynes, that this is now my fief. My methods differ from those of the Harkonnen. I don't care if you study the spice as long as I share what you discover. He glanced at the planetologist. The Harkonnens discouraged investigation of the spice, didn't they? Kynes stared back without answering. You may speak plainly. Oh, sorry. You may speak plainly, the Duke said, without fear of your skin. The Imperial Court is, indeed, a long way off, Kynes muttered, as he thought. What does this water-soft invader expect? Does he think me fool enough to enlist with him? The Duke chuckled, keeping his attention on the course. I detect a sour note in your voice, sir. We've waited in here with our mob of tame killers, eh? And we expect you to realize immediately that we're different from the Harkonnens. I've seen the propaganda you flooded into Siege and Village, Kynes said. Love, the good Duke, your core of... Here now, Halleck barked. He snapped his attention away from the window, leaned forward. Paul put a hand on Halleck's arm. Gurney, the Duke said. He glanced back. This man's been long under the Harkonnens. Halleck sat back. Your man Hawat's subtle, Kynes said, but his object's plain enough. Will you open those bases to us, then? The Duke said. Kynes spoke curtly. They're His Majesty's property. They're not being used. They could be used. Does His Majesty concur? Kynes darted a hard stare at the Duke. Arrakis could be an Eden if its rulers would look up from grubbing for spice. He didn't answer my question, the Duke thought, and he said, How is a planet to become an Eden without money? What is money, Kynes asked, if it won't buy the services you need? Ah, now, the Duke thought, and he said, We'll discuss this another time. Right now, I believe we're coming to the edge of the shield wall. Do I hold the same course? The same course, Kynes muttered. Paul looked out his window beneath them. The broken ground began to drop away in tumbled creases toward a barren rock plain and a knife-edged shelf. Beyond the shelf, fingernail crescents of dunes marched toward the horizon, with here and there in the distance a dull smudge, a darker blotch to tell of something not sand. Rock outcroppings, perhaps, in the heat-addled air. Paul couldn't be sure. Are there any plants down there? Paul asked. Some, Kynes said. This latitude's life zone has mostly what we call minor water stealers, adapted to raiding each other for moisture, gobbling up the trace dew. Some parts of the desert teem with life, but all of it has learned how to survive under these rigors. If you get caught down there, you imitate that life, or you die. You mean steal water from each other? Paul asked. The idea outraged him, and his voice betrayed his emotion. It's done, Kynes said, but that wasn't precisely my meaning. You see, my climate demands a special attitude towards water. You are aware of water at all times. You waste nothing that contains moisture. And the Duke thought, my climate. Come around 2 degrees more southerly, my lord, Kynes said. There's a blow coming up from the west. The Duke nodded. He had seen the billowing of tan dust. He banked the thopter around, noting the way the escort's wings reflected milky orange from the dust-refracted light as they turned to keep pace with him. This should clear the storm's edge, Kynes said. That sand must be dangerous if you fly into it, Paul said. Will it really cut the strongest metals? At this altitude, it's not the sand, but dust, Kynes said. The danger is lack of visibility, turbulence, clogged intakes. We'll see actual spice mining today? Paul asked. Very likely. Paul sat back. He had used the questions and hyper-awareness to do what his mother called registering the person. He had Kynes now. Tone of voice, each detail of face and gesture, an unnatural folding of the left sleeve on the man's robe told of a knife in the arm sheath. The waist bulged strangely. It was said that desert men wore a belted sash into which they tucked a small necessities. Perhaps the bulges came from such a sash. Certainly not from a concealed shield belt. A copper pin engraved with the likeness of a hair clasped to the neck of Kynes' robe. Another smaller pin with a similar likeness hung at the corner of the hood, which was thrown back over his shoulders. Halleck twisted in the seat beside Paul, reached back into the rear compartment, and brought out his ballast set. Kynes looked around as Halleck tuned the instrument, then returned his attention to their course. What would you like to hear, young master? Halleck asked. Your choose, Gurney, Paul said. Halleck bent his ear close to the sounding board, strummed a chord, and sang softly. Our fathers ate manna in the desert, in the burning places where whirlwinds came. Lord, save us from that horrible land. Save us, oh, save us from the dry and thirsty land. Kynes glanced at the Duke, said, You do travel with light complement of guards, my lord. Are all of them such men of many talents? Gurney, the Duke chuckled. Gurney's one of a kind. I like him with me for his eyes. His eyes miss very little. The planetologist frowned. Without missing a beat in his tune, Halleck interposed. For I am like an owl of the desert, oh, I am like an owl of the desert. The Duke reached down, brought up a microphone from the instrument panel, thumbed it to life, said, Leader to escort Gemma, flying object at 9 o'clock, Sector B. Do you identify it? It's merely a bird, Kynes said, and added, You have sharp eyes. The panel speaker crackled, then, Escort Gemma, object examined, under full amplification. It's a large bird. Paul looked in the indication direction, saw the distant speck, a dot of intermittent motion, and realized how keyed up his father must be. Every sense was a full alert. I'd not realized there were birds that large this far into the desert, the Duke said. That's likely an eagle, Kynes said. Many creatures have adapted to this place. The ornithopter swept over a bare rock plain. Paul looked down from their 2,000 meters altitude, saw the wrinkled shadow of their craft and escort. The land beneath seemed flat, but shadow wrinkles said otherwise. Has anyone ever walked out of the desert? The Duke asked. Halleck's music stopped. He leaned forward to catch the answer. Not from the deep desert, Kynes said. Men have walked out of the second zone several times. They've survived by crossing the rock areas where worms seldom go. The timbre of Kynes' voice held Paul's attention. He felt his sense come alert, the way they were trained to do. Ah, the worms, the Duke said. I must see one sometime. You may see one today, Kynes said. Wherever there is spice, there are worms. Always? Halleck asked. Always. Is there a relationship between worm and spice? The Duke asked. Kynes turned, and Paul saw the pursed lips as the man spoke. They defend spice sands. Each worm has a territory. As to the spice, who knows? Worm specimens we've examined lead us to suspect complicated chemical interchanges within them. We find of hydrochloric acid traces in the ducts, more complicated acid forms elsewhere. I'll give you my monograph on the subject. And a shield's defense, no? The Duke asked. Shields? Kynes sneered. Activate a shield within the worm zone, and you seal your fate. Worms ignore territory lines, come from far around to attack a shield. No man wearing a shield has ever survived such an attack. How are worms taken, then? High-voltage electric shock applied separately to each ring segment is the only known way of killing or preserving an entire worm, Kynes said. They can be stunned and shattered by explosives, but each ring segment has a life of its own. Barring atomics, I know of no explosive powerful enough to destroy a large worm entirely. They're incredibly tough. Why hasn't an effort been made to wipe them out? Paul asked. Too expensive, Kynes said. Too much area to cover. Paul leaned back in his corner. His truth-sense awareness of tone shadings told him that Kynes was lying and telling half-truths. And he thought, if there's a relationship between spice and worms, killing the worms would destroy the spice. No one will have to walk out of the desert soon, the Duke said. Trip these little transmitters at our necks and rescue is on its way. All our workers will be wearing them before long. We're setting up a special rescue service. Very commendable, Kynes said. Your tone says you don't agree, the Duke said. Static electricity from sandstorms masks... Oh, sorry. Agree. Of course I agree, but it won't be much use. Static electricity from sandstorms masks out many signals. Transmitters short out. They've been tried here before, you know. Arrakis is tough on equipment, and if a worm's hunting you, there's not much time. Frequently, you have no more than 15 or 20 minutes. What would you advise? The Duke asked. You ask my advice. As planetologist, yes. You'd follow my advice? If I found it sensible. Very well, my lord. Never travel alone. The Duke turned his attention from the controls. That's all? That's all. Never travel alone. What if you're separated by a storm and forced down? Halleck asked. Is there anything you could do? Anything covers much territory, Kynes said. What would you do? Paul asked. Kynes turned a hard stare at the boy, brought his attention back to the Duke. I'd remember to protect the integrity of my stillsuit. If I were outside the worm zone or in rock, I'd stay with the ship. If I were down in open sand, I'd get away from the ship as fast as I could. About 1,000 meters would be far enough. Then I'd hide beneath my robe. A worm would get the ship, but it might miss me. Then what? Halleck asked. Kynes shrugged. Wait for the worm to leave. That's all, Paul asked. When the worm has gone, one may try to walk out, Kynes said. You must walk softly. Avoid drum sands, tidal dust basins. Head for the nearest rock zone. There are many such zones. You might make it. Drum sand? Drum sand? Halleck asked. A condition of sand compaction, Kynes said. The slightest step sets it drumming. Worms always come to that. And tidal dust basin? The Duke asked. Certain depressions in the desert have filled with dust over the centuries. Some are so vast they have currents and tides. All will swallow the unwary who step into them. Halleck sat back, resumed strumming the balisette. Presently he sang, Wild beasts of the desert do hunt there, waiting for innocence to pass. Oh, tempt not the gods of the desert, lest you seek a lonely epitaph. The perils of the... He broke off, leaned forward. Dust cloud ahead, sire. I see it, Gurney. That's what we seek, Kynes said. Paul stretched up in the seat to peer ahead, saw a rolling yellow cloud low on the desert surface some 30 kilometers ahead. One of your factory crawlers, Kynes said. It's on the surface, and that means it's on spice. The cloud is vented sand being expelled after the spice has been centrifugally removed. There's no other cloud quite like it. Aircraft over it? I see 2, 3, 4 spotters, Kynes said. They're waiting for worm sign. Worm sign? A sand wave moving toward the crawler. They'll have a seismic probe on the surface, too. Worms sometimes travel too deep for the wave to show. Kynes swung his gaze around the sky. Should be a carryall wing around, but I don't see it. The worms always come, eh? Halleck asked. Always. Paul leaned forward, touched Kynes' shoulder. How big an area does each worm stake out? Kynes frowned. The child kept asking adult questions. That depends on the size of the worm. What's the variation? The Duke asked. Big ones may control 300 or 400 square kilometers. Small ones... He broke off as the Duke kicked on the jet brakes. The ship bucked as its tail pods whispered to silence. Stub wings elongated, cupped the air. The craft became a full thopter. As the Duke banked, holding the wings to a gentle beat, pointing with his left hand off to the east beyond the factory crawler. Is that worm sign? Kynes leaned across the Duke to peer into the distance. Paul and Halleck were crowded together looking in the same direction. Paul noted that their escort, caught by sudden maneuver, had surged ahead, but now was curving back. The factory crawler lay ahead of them, still some 3 kilometers away. Where the Duke pointed, crescent dune tracks spread, shadow ripples toward the horizon, and, running through them as a level line stretching into the distance, came an elongated mount in motion, a cresting of sand. It reminded Paul of the way a big fish disturbed the water when swimming just under the surface. "Worm," Kynes said. "Big one." He leaned back, grabbed the microphone from the panel, punched out a new frequency selection. Glancing at the grid chart on rollers over their heads, he spoke into the microphone. "Calling crawler at Delta Ajax Niner. Worm sign warning. Crawler at Delta Ajax Niner. Worm sign warning. Acknowledge, please." He waited. The panel speaker emitted static crackles. Then a voice. "Who calls Delta Ajax Niner? Over." They seemed to be pretty calm about it. Kynes spoke into the microphone. "Unlisted flight, north and east of you about 3 kilometers. Worm sign is on intercept course. Your position, estimated contact 25 minutes. Another voice rumbled from the speaker. "This is spotter control. Sighting confirmed. Stand by for a contact fix." There was a pause then. "Contact in 26 minutes. That's a sharp estimate. Who's on that unlisted flight? Over." Halleck had his harness off and surged forward between Kynes and the Duke. "Is this regular working frequency, Kynes?" "Yes. Why?" "Who'd be listening?" "Just the work crews in that area. Cuts down interference." Again, the speaker crackled. Then, "This is Delta Ajax Niner. Who gets bonus credit for that spot? Over." Halleck glanced at the Duke. Kynes said, "There's a bonus based on spice load for whoever gives first worm warning. They want to know." "Tell them who had first sight of the worm," Halleck said. The Duke nodded. Kynes hesitated, then lifted the microphone. "Spotter credit to Duke Leto Atreides. Duke Leto Atreides. Over." The voice from the speaker was flat, partly distorted by a burst of static. "We read and thank you." "Now, tell them to divide the bonus among themselves," Halleck ordered. "Tell them it's the Duke's wish." Kynes took a deep breath. Then, "It's the Duke's wish that you divide the bonus among your crew. Do you read? Over." "Acknowledged and thank you," speaker said. The Duke said, "I forgot to mention that Gurney is also very talented in public relations." Kynes turned a puzzled frown on Halleck. "This lets the men know their Duke is concerned for their safety," Halleck said. "Word will get around. It was on an area working frequency. Not likely Harkonnen agents heard." He glanced out at their air cover. "And we're a pretty strong force. It was a good risk." The Duke banked their craft toward the sand cloud erupting from the factory crawler. "What happens now?" "There's a carryall wing somewhere close," Kynes said. "It'll come in a lift off the crawler." "What if the carryall's wrecked?" Halleck asked. "Some equipment is lost," Kynes said. "Getting close over the crawler, my lord. You'll find this interesting." The Duke scowled, busied himself with the controls as they came into turbulent air over the crawler. Paul looked down and saw sand still spewing out of the metal and plastic monster beneath. It looked like a great tan and blue beetle, with many wide tracks extending on arms around it. He saw a giant inverted funnel poked into the dark sand in front of him. "Rich spice bed in by the color," Kynes said. "They'll continue working until the last minute." The Duke fed more power to the wings, stiffened them for a steeper descent as he settled lower in a circling glide above the crawler. A glance left and right showed his cover holding altitude and circling overhead. Paul studied the yellow cloud belching from the crawler's pipe vents, looked out over the desert at the approaching worm track. "Shouldn't we be hearing them call in the carryall?" Halleck asked. "They usually have the wing on a different frequency," Kynes said. "Shouldn't they have 2 carryalls standing by for every crawler?" the Duke asked. "There should be 26 men on that machine down there, not to mention cost of equipment." Kynes said, "You don't have enough He broke off as the speaker erupted with an angry voice. "Any of you see the wing? He isn't answering." A garble of noise crackled from the speaker, drowned in an abrupt override signal, then silence, and the first voice. "Report by the numbers. Over." "This is spotter control. Last I saw the wing was pretty high, circling off northwest. I don't see him now. Over." "Spotter 1, negative. Over." "Spotter 2, negative. Over." "Spotter 3, negative. Over." Silence. The Duke looked down. His own craft shadow was just passing over the crawler. "Only 4 spotters. Is that right?" Correct, Kynes said. "There are 5 in our party," the Duke said. "Our ships are larger. We can crowd in 3 extra each. Their spotters ought to be able to lift off 2 each." Paul did the mental arithmetic, said, "That's 3 short." "Why don't they have 2 carryalls to each crawler?" barked the Duke. "You don't have enough extra equipment," Kynes said. "All the more reason we should protect what we have." "Where could that carryall go?" Halleck asked. "Could have been forced down somewhere out of sight," Kynes said. The Duke grabbed the microphone, hesitated with thumb poised over the switch. "How could they lose sight of a carryall?" "They keep their attention on the ground looking for worm sign," Kynes said. The Duke thumbed the switch, spoke into the microphone. "This is your Duke. We are coming down to take off Delta Ajax 9er's cruise. All spotters are ordered to comply. Spotters will land on the east side. We will take the west. Over." He reached down, punched out his own command frequency, repeated the order for his own air covered, handed the microphone back to Kynes. Kynes returned to the working frequency, and a voice blasted from the speaker. "Almost a full spice load! We have almost a full load! We can't leave that for a damned worm! Over!" "Damn the spice!" the Duke barked. He grabbed back the microphone, said, "We can always get more spice. There are seats in our ships for all but 3 of you. Draw straws or decide any way you like who's to go, but you're going, and that's in order." He slammed the microphone back into Kynes' hand, muttered, "Sorry," as Kynes shook an injured finger. "How much time?" 9 minutes, Kynes said. The Duke said, "The ship has more power than the others. If we took off under jet with 3/4 wings, we could crowd in an additional man." "That's sand soft," Kynes said. "With 4 extra men aboard on a jet takeoff, we could snap the wings, sire," Halleck said. "Not on this ship," the Duke said. He hauled back on the control as the Thopter glided in beside the crawler. The wings tipped up, barked the Thopter to a skidding stop with 20 meters to the factory. The crawler was silent now. No sand spouting from its vents. Only a faint mechanical rumble issued from it, becoming more audible as the Duke opened his door. Immediately, their nostrils were assailed by the odor of cinnamon. Heavy and pungent. With a loud flapping, the spotter aircraft glided down to the sand on the other side of the crawler. The Duke's own escort swooped in to land in line with them. Paul, looking out at the factory, saw how all the Thopters were dwarfed by it. Gnats beside a warrior beetle. "Gurney, you and Paul toss out the rear seat," the Duke said. He manually cranked the wings out 3/4, set their angle, checked the jet pod controls. "Why the devil aren't they coming out of that machine?" "They're hoping the carryall will show up," Kynes said. "They still have a few minutes." He glanced off to the east. All turned to look the same direction, seeing no sign of the worm, but there was a heavy, charged feeling of anxiety in the air. The Duke took the microphone, punched for his command frequency, said, "2 of you toss out your shield generators. By the numbers. You can carry 1 more man that way. We're not leaving any men for that monster." He keyed back to the working frequency, barked, "All right, you and Delta Ajax 9er, out. Now. This is a command from your Duke. On the double, or I'll cut the crawler apart with a laser gun." A hatch snapped open near the front of the factory, another at the rear, another at the top. Men came tumbling out, sliding and scrambling down to the sand. A tall man in a patched working robe was the last to emerge. He jumped down to a track and then to the sand. The Duke hung the microphone on the panel, swung out onto the wing's step, shouted, 2 men each into your spotters." The man in the patched robe began tolling off pairs of his crew, pushing them toward the craft waiting on the other side. Four over here," the Duke shouted. 4 into that ship back there." He jabbed a finger at an escort Thopter directly behind him. The guards were just wrestling the shield generator out of it. "And 4 onto that ship over there." He pointed to the other escort that had shed its shield generator. 3 each into the others. "Run, you sand dogs!" The tall man finished counting off his crew, came slogging across the sand, followed by 3 of his companions. "I hear the worm, but I can't see it," Kynes said. The others heard it, an abrasive slithering, distant, and growing louder. "Damn sloppy way to operate," the Duke muttered. Aircraft began flapping off the sand around them. It reminded the Duke of a time in his home planet's jungles, a sudden emergence into a clearing, and carrion birds lifting away from a carcass of a wild ox. The spice workers slogged up on the sand of the Thopter, started climbing in. The Duke, Halleck helped, dragging them into the rear. In you go, boys, he snapped. On the double. Paul, crowded into a corner by sweating men, smelled the perspiration of fear, saw that two of the men had poor neck adjustments on their stillsuits. He filled the information in his memory for future action. His father would have to order tighter stillsuit discipline. Men tended to become sloppy if you didn't watch such things. The last man came gasping into the rear, said, "The worm, it's almost on us! Blast off!" The Duke slid into his seat, frowning, said, "We still have 3 minutes on the original contact estimate. Is that right, Kynes?" He shut his door, checked it. "Almost exactly, my lord," Kynes said, and he thought, "A cool one, this Duke." "All secure here, sire," Halleck said. The Duke nodded, watched the last of escort take off. He adjusted the igniter, glanced once more at wings and instruments, punched the jet sequence. The takeoff pressed the Duke and Kynes deep into their seats, compressed the people in the rear. Kynes watched the way the Duke handled the controls. Gently, surely. The Thopter was fully airborne now, and the Duke studied his instruments, glanced left and right at his wings. "She's very heavy, sire," Halleck said. "Well within the tolerances of the ship," the Duke said. "You didn't really think I'd risk this cargo, did you, Gurney?" Halleck grinned, said, "Not a bit of it, sire." The Duke banked his craft in a long, easy curve, climbing over the crawler. Paul, crushed into a corner beside a window, stared down at the silent machine on the sand. The worm sign had broken off about 400 meters from the crawler, and now there appeared to be turbulence in the sand around the factory. "The worm is now beneath the crawler," Kynes said. "You are about to witness a thing few have seen." Flecks of dust shadowed the sand around the crawler. Now, the big machine began to tip down to the right. A gigantic sand whirlpool began forming there to the right of the crawler. It moved faster and faster. Sand and dust filled the air now for hundreds of meters around. Then they saw it. A wide hole emerged from the sand. Sunlight flashed from glistening white spokes within it. The hole's diameter was at least twice the length of the crawler. Paul estimated. He watched as the machine slid into that opening in a billow of dust and sand. The hole pulled back. "Gods, what a monster," muttered a man besides Paul. "Got all our flogging spice," growled another. "Someone is going to pay for this," the Duke said. "I promise you that." By the very flatness of his father's voice, Paul sensed the deep anger. He found that he shared it. This was criminal waste. In the silence that followed, they heard Kynes. "Bless the Maker and his water." Kynes murmured, "Bless the coming and going of him. May his passage cleanse the world. May he keep the world for his people." "What's that you're saying?" the Duke asked. But Kynes remained silent. Paul glanced at the men crowded around him. They were staring fearfully at the back of Kynes' head. One of them whispered, "Liet." Kynes turned, scowling. The man sank back, abashed. Another of the rescued men began coughing, dry and rasping. Presently he gasped, "Curse this hellhole!" The tall DUNE man who had come last out of the crawler said, "Be still, Koss. You but worsen your cough." He stirred among the men until he could look through them at the back of the Duke's head. "You be the Duke Leto, I warrant," he said. "It's we give thanks to our lives. We were ready to end it there until you came along." "Quiet, man, and let the Duke fly his ship," Halleck muttered. Paul glanced at Halleck. He, too, had seen the tension wrinkles at the corner of his father's jaw. One walked softly when the Duke was in rage. Leto began easing his Thopter out of its great banking circle, stopped at a sign of movement on the sand. The worm had withdrawn into the depths, and now, near where the crawler had been, two figures could be seen moving away from the sand depression. They appeared to glide over the surface with hardly a lifting of dust to mark their passage. "Who's that down there?" "Two Johnnies came along for the ride, sore," said the tall DUNE man. "Why wasn't something said about them?" "It was the chance they took, sore," the DUNE man said. "My lord," said Kynes, "these men know it's of little use to do anything about men trapped on the desert in Worm Country. We'll send a ship from base for them, said the Duke. As you wish, my lord, but likely when the ships get here, there'll be no one to rescue. We'll send a ship anyway, the Duke said. They were right beside where the worm came up. How'd they escape? Paul asked. The sides of the hole cave in and make the distances deceptive, Kynes said. You waste fuel here, sire, Halleck ventured. Aye, Gurney. The Duke brought the craft around toward the shield wall. His escort came down from circling stations, took up positions above and on both sides. Paul thought about what the Dune man said, Kynes had said. He sensed half-truths, outright lies. The men on the sand had glided across the surface so surely, moving in a way obviously calculated to keep from luring the worm back out of the depths. Fremen, Paul thought. Who else would be so sure on the sand? Who else might be left out of your worries as a matter of course? Because they are in no danger. They know how to live here. They know how to outwit the worm. What were Fremen doing on that crawler? Paul asked. Kynes' world. The tall Dune man turned wide eyes on Paul, blue within blue within blue. Who be this lad? He asked. Halleck moved to place himself between the man and Paul. This is Paul Atreides, the ducal heir. Why says he there were Fremen on our rumbler? The man asked. They fit the description, Paul said. Kynes snorted. You can't tell Fremen just by looking at them. He looked at the Dune man. You, who were those men? Friends of one of the others, the Dune man said. Just friends from the village who wanted to see the spice sands. Kynes turned away. Fremen? But he was remembering the words of the legend. The Lisan al-Gaib shall see through all subterfuge. They be dead now, most likely, young sir, the Dune man said. We should not speak unkindly on them. But Paul heard the falsehood in their voices, felt the menace that had brought Halleck instinctively into guarding position. Paul spoke dryly. A terrible place for them to die. Without turning, Kynes said, When God hath ordained a creature to die in a particular place, he causeth that creature's wants to direct him to that place. Leto turned a hard stare at Kynes, and Kynes, returning the stare, found himself troubled by a fact he had observed here. The Duke was concerned more over the men than he was over the spice. He risked his own life and that of his son to save the men. He passed off the loss of a spice crawler with a gesture. The threat to men's lives had him in a rage. A leader such as that would command fantastic loyalty. He would be difficult to defeat. Against his own will and all previous judgments, Kynes admitted to himself, I like this Duke. And with that, we end at chapter 16 on page 204. I freaking love this book. I love everything about it. If you'd like to support more readings of this by me, please subscribe, share, tell others, and go ahead and look at the earlier chapters. Leave any comments, any notes, any suggestions in the comments. I always read them because I'm not like crazy popular. And thank you very much. I also have links to my published works, which more directly support me and my endeavors. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day. Stay comfy out there.